You may pick one.
But item box, I couldn't pick only one.
Alright, maybe you could pick two.
Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, I have played the hell out of various Monster Hunter games since I first started my journey with the series over 7 years ago now. And in this time, I have spent a lot of time exploring the weapons in search of my favorite playstyle, and while many people often find one weapon they get really super attached to and then never want to do anything else, even in newer Monster Hunter games, I don't work quite the same way. I have my favorite weapons, but usually that ranking changes per game. I have my sort of mains that I usually stick to generally, but that is sort of a plural term for me because I can never only play one singular weapon no matter how much I love it, and honestly my ranking between them changes with every game as well, because every weapon type in Monster Hunter is enjoyable in its own entirely different way. But today, with Monster Hunter Wilds coming out in just a few days, and me being completely blind to any and all changes the weapons have got for their 6th generation versions, I'm going to look back and rank the 14 mainline weapon types by my current opinions of them, with most of my playtime with all of them being in the 5th generation games. This won't be a power ranking or anything like that. I'm not ranking what's strong versus what's weak. It's based purely on how much fun that I have personally while using them and why, for the best possible direct contrast of my knowledge before we get to start playing Wilds. And of course, with that, I am absolutely in high hopes that this ranking will shift as I learn about the changes that will be coming with the game too. And it's also worth mentioning, hey, maybe don't take this list too seriously. I genuinely enjoy using every weapon in Monster Hunter. This is just my comparisons between them all. That said, down in 14th place, I have light bowgun. I feel the agility of it is pretty fun, and I feel it actually got significantly more enjoyable in Rise and Sunbreak to me than it was in World and prior, but I have a severe dislike of ammo management in hunting games. I enjoy the moment-to-moment gameplay, but anytime I have to rework my radial wheel and customize it so I can craft ammo quickly mid-zone, and while trying to avoid having my face caved in at the same time, I find it a very sort of unusual extra immersion break that takes me out of the hunt a bit. Bowgun mains will probably say that is part of playing bowgun, that is part of the hunt for bowguns, but I feel it takes me out of the hunting experience itself. That said, as for why it is in the 14th slot for me, even compared to the other bowgun, I just like the big beefier hits more of the heavy bowgun. I like big explosions, and I like the special ammo options more for heavy bowguns too. That said, I've always had a soft spot for specifically sticky light bowgun as a playstyle. I know that's not an unusual niche to have, and it's the one that arguably requires the most ammo crafting, so it's a bit contradictory to what I said, but I guess I like stunning monsters and aiming for the head or something. I don't know. That said, in 13th place I have heavy bowguns. The version of this that I've had the most fun with myself was World and Iceborne, and yeah, call me boring, but I really like doing a guard-based spread ammo set. There was something really satisfying about holding a giant anti-tank cannon with a shield attached to it, and how that made you just an immovable object while you stick close to the weak spots, blasting them with a giant shotgun burst at close range. It's fun. Honestly, I really like pierce ammo as well. I think it's really cool for the longer monsters, but I've also done some really silly stuff with heavy bowguns over the years too, such as tenderize attack only heavy bowgun in Iceborne, which, as simple as it is, was actually really effective and satisfying to play, especially with the visual effect every time you exploded yourself off of the monster. And even just stuff like trying to play fully around Wyvern Heart and being a Gatling gun main. The weapon has a ton of variety available within itself, and for that I absolutely respect it, but it just isn't quite my main cup of tea. Moving on to 12th place, I've got the Lance. Lance has always been just sort of my least favorite melee weapon. I still enjoy Lance, I have played Lance, I find it fun being an immovable wall, as I mentioned when talking about heavy bowgun, but even while Rise and Sunbreak added some more variety to the weapon, a lot of it is just sort of poking and guarding, and I am someone who likes variety and adaptability far too much to enjoy being constrained into that little sort of bubble, even if the Lance-specific bubble that is guard and poke is an undeniably effective one once you get good at it. That said, it gained a lot of cool factor from the wire bugs and switch skill maneuvers it gained in Rise and Sunbreak, but even with that, it was still my least played melee weapon in the game. It just never quite clicked. It was cool, but it just wasn't quite for me. That said, it's worth noting, I don't expect wire bugs to be in Wild, so I am a bit worried about how the weapon will need to evolve to actually feel like an improvement from Rise and Sunbreak, but hey, maybe the next time I do a weapon ranking list, Lance will actually be higher up. I have no idea. In 11th place then, I've got the Switch Axe. In World and Iceborne, I actually really enjoyed Switch Axe in Rise and Sunbreak. It changes quite a bit, and it moved into being a more complex weapon in general, and the efficient gameplay loops using it were much less less enjoyable to me than they were in World and Iceborne. I love zero-sum discharge, I love wild swing for all of its silliness and surprising effectiveness too, but personally I just never adjusted to the changes that the weapon got in Rise and Sunbreak, so it ended up one of my least used weapons. That said, again, like Lance, I have no idea how the weapon is going to look in Wilds, and I may well find myself very pleasantly surprised, depending on how they choose to improve and add on to it. Next up in the 10th place then, I've got Insect Glaive. This one has always been relatively simple for me to rank because I really like the concept of the weapon. I think it's awesome in Monster Hunter to have a weapon that actually works with a living creature as a part of your moveset, but using the Kinsect to gather buffs has always felt more like a chore than an enjoyable gameplay mechanic. And I've always really loved the aerial nature of the weapon moveset, the parts that you can do where you just bounce off the monster, but they've been pushing us away from those slowly one bit at a time every game with more and more buffs to the grounded movesets, or more additions to use while grounded specifically. Rise and Sunbreak though did have some cool, more aerial wirebug skills you could use, but I don't expect wirebug to stick around, so it's mostly a matter of what they choose to iterate on and move forward with in Wilds. Insect Glaive to me is essentially a weapon full of fun concepts that just never quite gel with me on their actual execution. I enjoy it, but not for long periods. That said, they do seem to be making the time to gather buffs with the Kinsect shorter and shorter with each game, and I hope that they continue this, because then I would have really high hopes for the weapon in Wilds becoming hopefully even smoother on the downtime between the bits where you're hitting the monster with your weapon. Moving on to 9th place then, I've got Dual Blades. This was the first weapon that I picked up in my Monster Hunter journey. I love the pure speed of it. I love the double reverse grip and demon mode, and even the Naruto run. It just oozes style. The Beyblade jump attack was incredible when it first showed up in World, and then moving into Rise and Sunbreak, they made the weapon significantly more complex, but in a number of ways it became a lot more fluid. It gained a lot more variety of options, and honestly, as much as I really do enjoy dual blades, I think it's just become a reflex speed problem for me more than anything. Dual blades are a very reactive weapon. I mean, don't get me wrong, you can proactively position yourself ahead of time, but there are a lot of very split-second reaction differences that can totally change the experience with this weapon. And oftentimes, the sign of a really good dual blades player is that they will never stop attacking. Even while they're avoiding attacks, they are still doing damage, sticking to the monster's weak spots like a swarm of locusts, taking the form of a hunter. And maybe over the last 7 years, I've just gotten slower, maybe the weapon's gotten faster, but it's gone to a place where I enjoy playing dual blades, absolutely, but I just don't feel anywhere close to as comfortable with them as I do with my remaining entries on the list. On which note, in 8th place, I've got Gun Lance. This was actually the weapon that grabbed my attention the most when I first started playing, and went in the training room before even starting a hunt. I love the concept of an explosive cannon lance with a big shield on top of it, and it essentially immediately invalidated regular lance in my opinion as a result too, but I could tell very quickly that it was going to end up being a complex weapon, maybe too much so for an absolute beginner, and so I put it to the side while I learned the game as a whole. Eventually, in the endgame of Iceborne, I really started playing a lot of Gun Lance though. In fact, it was the weapon that I used most for probably like a month or two, just really enjoying it. And then in Rise and Sunbreak, while it obviously wasn't my main weapon, I did still play it quite a bit. I enjoy endgame Gun Lance specifically more than any other part of the journey with it, because the way that Gun Lance builds tend to work, they can both be optimized for damage and have a lot of room for comfort skills, much more than other weapons do, especially in more shelling damage focused setups. Then Sunbreak had Bullet Barrage as well, which was awesome, and of course it was a ton of fun, but by no means do I expect Bullet Barrage to stay on the weapon moving on into Wilds. I know that we're at like a halfway point of this list here, but this is a weapon that I genuinely love. I just have slightly less love for it than the options I put above it. Then in 7th place we have Bow. This is the highest slot for a ranged weapon on my list, and Bow was my first real main weapon, honestly. I played through all of Base World with dual blades, yes, but then I started trying out Hammer in the endgame, moving on and gave a crack at then Dragon Piercer specialized bow build, but because I got so into the Dragon Piercer build, then from that point, Bow just sort of spoke to me, and I learned how to play more regular sort of dash and shoot style builds, and I just had a lot of fun with Bow in Base World. I played it for a much longer period of time than I played dual blades, and I had a really fun time with it too. Iceborne then added in Thousand Dragons as a concept which I enjoyed as well for its meme potential, and then Rise and Sunbreak completely changed the way that bows function in a lot of different ways, to such an extent that it feels almost hard to rank both of these versions of Bow on the same ranking. I like the idea of pierce and spread type bows a lot is my main takeaway from it. I like things like Dodge Bolt as a switch skill. There was a lot more variety and options added to Bow, and Dragon Piercer was still very usable and buildable around too. The playstyle was both very similar yet also different because of all of the new options, and it complicated a weapon that I felt was relatively simple before that point. That said, both 5th generation variations of Bow were really fun to me, and so I'm I'm really happy with 7th place for the weapon, and I'm quite excited to see where they take it moving forwards into 6th generation with Wilds. In 6th place then, I've got the Charge Blade. Originally, I avoided this weapon like the plague because people said it was the most complex of all 14 weapon types, and that put me off a bit, but eventually I gave it a go, and sure, the sort of barrier to entry on the weapon is a bit steep compared to most. I would not recommend the first time you hold a Charge Blade being on a hunt. Definitely take it into the training room first, maybe look up a little bit of a basics guide just to understand it, because understanding how to fill and manage your files, how and when to transform into axe mode and how to use it, and how to best make use of your files as well, on top of things like guard points especially, are such an important part of the weapon. There is a lot to sort of digest from an informational standpoint, but the thing is, once you have a grasp of the mechanics of the weapon, it all just sort of flows together really easily and simply when you're on the actual hunts. Guard points into super amped element discharge is just endlessly satisfying, but when they added in Savage Axe mode, I also absolutely adored that too, like a freaking chainsaw on a stick. What a cool addition to an already very badass weapon. Rise and Sunbreak added a lot of extra changes for the weapon too, but not any that really made me like it more or less, honestly. It just sort of made the weapon feel more like Charge Blade to me, if that makes sense. It felt directly in line with how the weapon already functioned, just more of it, at least to me personally. Then moving on to 5th place, I've got Sword and Shield. When I first started playing in base world, this weapon felt incredibly simple to me, probably too simple, but then when Josh and I went through Generations Ultimate, it actually became one of my main weapons through the majority of that game, because all it took to make SNS interesting to me was to give it Hunter Arts, honestly. Then came Iceborne, adding in the perfect rush combo mechanic, and I absolutely adored that. It fixed the weak point of the weapon for me. It's a combo that increases your damage if you get good at specific button pressing rhythm, and I'm someone who loves rhythm games as well, so that sort of worked together for it as well. And then in Rise and Sunbreak, they just expanded on these things even further, adding even more cool factor to the weapon, and that was exactly what I felt that it needed. Essentially, Sword and Shield as a base moveset, slashing options, bashing options, the round slashes to change the angle of your attack, back hops for repositioning, and of course the fact that you can use items without having to sheath your weapon. It's all a really solid and comfortable way to play Monster Hunter, but it was the additions to the weapon in Iceborne and then Rise and Sunbreak that gave it that real extra cool factor that made me really start to enjoy it, past it just feeling comfortable. Also, you can stun monsters by using the shield attack, so it's an honorary bonking weapon as far as I'm concerned, which are my favorite types of weapon. Going up to 4th place then, I've got the Great Sword. I know I don't talk about the weapon that much personally or play it much in videos, but that's because Josh is like the Great Sword guy. It doesn't mean that I don't play or like Greatsword, but it just feels almost redundant for me to spend too much time with a weapon where I can already see it being played and get essentially secondhand satisfaction from just being in hunts playing with Josh while he's doing the cool stuff. Because, don't tell him I said this, but sometimes he can do some really cool shit with that big bladed stick of his instead of just missing. There's something primally satisfying about a big charged attack from an oversized weapon, there's no doubt about it, and between the crit draw builds of old, the true charge slash focus builds as well, or moving into Rise and Sunbreak with the addition of Rage Slash as well, which was essentially a high damage parrying slash, which is just cool as all hell in its own right as well. A very fun weapon, and one that I have a lot of admiration for as well. Then in 3rd place, the last sharp weapon on the list, Longsword. This is the weapon I have mained for the longest period of time outside of the first two on the list, of course. I played a fair bit of this in base world before Iceborne came out, before I eventually got infatuated with another weapon that we haven't talked about yet. And then the end game of Iceborne, it really started to click with me too, partially because I really liked the EI slash encounter additions that they added for Longsword in this expansion, but in a weird way, mostly because I could stun with Longsword, and that got me into it again. Look, okay, I like stunning monsters, and this wasn't intentional. I'm just realizing that a lot of my enjoyment with Longsword started when I realized I could pair the Punishing Draw skill, which added stun value to draw attacks, and the EI slash encounter, as both of them technically counted as draw attacks. And there's something so unbelievably satisfying about getting the EI counter into a stun knockdown. I really love that, especially the fact that it worked even further with things like Frostcraft gear as well. And this led me to experiment even more with Longsword, and then in Rise and Sunbreak, I continued to do Punishing Draw Longsword builds, but I also moved towards funkier stuff like Sakura Slash focused element build, which I'd found really fun too. It definitely was a bit more niche, but it was really cool. The weapon has a lot of options, it's always flashy, and the fact that there are multiple alternate playstyles that are still more than strong enough to kill the tough monsters made me like it even more. Then we move up to the top 2, and this is where it gets really hard for me, because it essentially depends on which which game we're talking about, and I am tempted to just give them both a joint tied #1 entry as a result, which I think is extra applicable ahead of Wilds because, well, if I understood the reveal trailer correctly, and trust me, I've watched it like 1,000 times at this point, I feel like we're going to be able to swap between 2 weapons on hunts in Wilds. And if I'm right, then you all probably know that is fact and think it's weird that I'm saying it this way, but I'm going with my 2 favorite weapons, and you can't stop me. Hunting horn I enjoyed a bit in Iceborne for sure, but just found it really slow and sort of difficult to get used to as a newer player, despite the fact that it is and always has been my favorite weapon concept in Monster Hunter. I mean, it's basically a gigantic hammer that plays music. What is not to love about that? Rise and Sunbreak completely redesigned the combat flow of Hunting Horn, and I fell in love with the new style. It was so unbelievably fast, it was so stylish, there were iframes built into parts of the moveset, and eventually it even started to lean towards being an elemental weapon instead of a raw attack focused one too. It truly evolved and got really just funky through the course of Rise and Sunbreak, and I had a great time using it there as well. That said, I have absolutely no clue what Wilds Hunting Horn is going to be like, and for that main reason, if I absolutely had to choose between my top 2, I'd probably put Hunting Horn in second. It may be a carbon copy of World, it may be a carbon copy of Rise, or it could be that we're getting some weird, crazy mix between the 2 of them, which honestly I sort of hope for. And honestly, no matter what though, I am excited to find out what it is and do my best to master the art of the honkin' bonkin' Wilds. That said, in my first place slot then, I've got Hammer, my absolute love. Arguably one of the simplest movesets in the game, but that's because the weapon itself is heavily based on positioning and adaptability. The fast, simple explanation of the weapon is that you have your fast combo in the Gulf Swing, your slow combo that requires a more stationary target with Big Bang, and then you have your charge attacks for when those 2 aren't a viable option or if you've got to move. That's most of the actual thought process that you'll have with base Monster Hunter World Hammer, and yet it is still unbelievably satisfying to just repeatedly bonk a monster on the head with Hammer with every one of those methods of attack. And especially, honestly, the sound effects of hitting a monster in the head with a hammer is one of my favorite sound effects in all of Monster Hunter. It always has been, and that's probably a large part of my enjoyment too. In Iceborne, we got the Clutch Claw combo for this weapon as well. Then in base Monster Hunter Rise, they added Impact Crater, which was absolutely badass as like a big finishing move for Hammer, and then in Sunbreak they added a ton of extra stuff as well that sort of ended up muddying up the weapon for me. It made it more complex and drove a lot of the moment-to-moment gameplay away from the parts of the weapon that I really liked, and so Hammer I just sort of gelled with a little bit less in that expansion than I had beforehand for the entire 5th generation. In Wilds, I expect Hammer to go a bit back towards its simpler versions, but of course hopefully still with some sort of fun extra change. Like again, Base Rise I think was my favorite version of Hammer, where it was the more simplistic general moveset but with the addition of Impact Crater as a big hefty smashing finisher. But no matter what, I'm sure I will love Hammer in Wilds. That just about does it for today, and everyone, my own personal list ranking the 14 weapon types in main series Monster Hunter ahead of Monster Hunter Wilds itself, so you can see how my thoughts line up before any knowledge of the new changes. And I should mention I won't be looking at the comments of this video either to keep myself spoiler free for now, so feel free to laugh and joke about all the stuff you already know about changing for these weapons from the betas that make me look like a fool for things that I've said here. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.